So I think this is a good time for us to start. Welcome, everyone. My name is Suchitra Balachandran. I'm on the steering committee of Our Revolution Prince George's, and we are here to discuss a really important topic on an issue that the county is proposing to engage in. And I think the more we understand about this process, the more we will be able to advocate for what we think is right for the county. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to briefly introduce everyone who is on this panel, and you will hear from them in turn. So we're starting, we have Rahila Ahmed, who is on the Prince George's County Board of Education from District 5. We have two members from the national nonprofit think tank called In the Public Interest. It's a group that studies public goods and services and advocates for government that works for all of us. So from the group In the Public Interest, there's Jeremy Moeller, who's the communications director. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, USA Today, and elsewhere. And Shar Habibi, who is the research and policy director, also from the group In the Public Interest. She has received a master's in public affairs and an MBA from the University of Texas at Austin, which has a warm place in my heart because that's where I got my PhD from. So welcome, Shar and Jeremy. Also on the panel are Crystal Oriada, who is, as everybody knows, is a community activist and the founder of the LGBTQ Dignity Project. We have Jana Parker, who is a community activist and a former teacher in the school system. David Kahn, who many of you know is a longtime activist. He is here representing the Prince George's Civic Federation. And Martin Mitchell, who's the president of the Prince George's County Young Dems. So with that, let me turn the mic over to Rahila Ahmed, who will give us an explanation of where we are right now. All yours, Rahila.
Thank you, Suchitra. And good evening, everyone. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Rahila Ahmed, and I am the District 5 representative on the Prince George's County Board of Education. That's Bowie and parts of Mitchellville and Upper Marlboro. Just a little bit about me. I am a lifelong Prince Georgian, a former K-12 PGCPS student. And on this issue of a public-private partnership to build our county schools, I'm a very concerned citizen. Folks, essentially what we're talking about today is a nearly $1 billion, 30-year-long corporate contract to build 5 middle schools and 1 K-8 school in PGCPS. Earlier this month, PGCPS announced the group of companies that they've selected to contract with us for this project, and they are Fengate, Gilbane, Stantec, and Honeywell. The Board of Education will be asked to approve that selection on Wednesday, October 21st at the board meeting. The County Council will also be looking at a resolution to approve a P3 working agreement with PGCPS tomorrow, October 12th. Now, if you're getting on this webinar and thinking, I never knew about this P3 thing and how did we ever get here, indulge me for a moment as I walk you through all of that. Here are the reasons why P3 were indulged in the first place. First off, many of our school buildings are very old and need replacement. Those of you that have been in our buildings, you can attest to this. The other thing is we don't receive as much money as is needed to address all the construction projects that we need to. The third is that it takes several years to build a school or to modernize one. And the fourth is that we don't have time to wait several years because our student population in the North County is increasing rapidly and schools are unimaginably overcrowded and overused. Think we need something fast, we need it cheap but safe. This is why this method was even considered and how it really got this far. Now here's how it happened. Mind you, all these, what I'm gonna say now is all the pieces that I put together recently, and they weren't all known or sketched out in this way to elected leaders or to members of the community. But by my account, this kind of formally started at the state level. In spring of 2017, the Maryland Overcrowding Reduction Act was first introduced by Senator Rosapep of Prince George's County. And although it didn't pass that year, it was revised and did pass the state legislature the next year. So by May of 2018, it was signed into law by the governor. And what that act did was create a public school construction innovation incentive pilot program. Try saying that 3 times fast. That basically Prince George's County could participate in to advance an innovative model for building schools. It essentially gave us the clear to try this thing out. And so that same month, in May 2018, the county council created an alternative construction financing work group consisting of members from PGCPS and the county government to figure out what this could look like. A year later, in April of 2019, Senate Bill 1011 passed, also was sponsored by Senator Rosapep. It outlined the requirements and the exemptions for doing P3 in Prince George's County. So basically it was building out the framework for this project. And the governor signed that bill in May of 2019. That same month of May 2019, PGCPS put out what's called a request for qualifications, or RFQ, to companies to see if they could qualify for the project. 8 of the companies responded and the top 4 qualified. In September of 2019, my board colleagues voted on a resolution to support and move forward with the P3 process with a package of 6 middle and K through 8 schools. And then in November of 2019, the county council also authorized moving forward, and PGCPS subsequently put out a request for proposals, or an otherwise known as an RFP, from those 4 qualified candidates. So the RFQ narrowed down the pool, and the RFP vet that small pool. Between the time of November 2019 and August 2020, this year, the RFP was amended 5 times. Now that's just something that to note for y'all. Some of the most recent changes that have happened this year: this past July, my colleagues on the board approved the hiring of a P3 director to manage the project in this process. And shortly thereafter, at our August 2020 board retreat, the board received a presentation with updates on the P3 project. What we found out then was that, number 1, the district would be selecting the companies really soon. Number 2, we'd be asked to approve them in October. And number 3, that if the board were to approve them, PGCPS would go into a multi-month, quote unquote, exclusive negotiating agreement period with the selected companies. That would allow for PGCPS and that selected company to negotiate additional terms outside of the public eye. And so all of that brings us here to now. From my perspective, the one thing that has been clear throughout this process is that there have been a lot of changes in what this could look like. Cost estimates have gone up and down. The schools selected have changed. And although we've been told there are risks, we haven't had a real picture on what all those risks are. And I think we as a community need to know them, especially seeing what has happened with the Purple Line recently. So what we'll be doing tonight is walking through some of the risks associated with public entities engaging in large-scale public-private partnerships for construction, so that we can be aware of the impacts for our community. We'll also hear from some residents about their concerns, as well as answer some of your questions. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box today. My hope is that by the end of this session, you'll feel inspired to communicate to your concerns to me and my colleagues on the Board of Education, as well as the County Council. With that, I've spoken enough. I'll hand it back to Suchitra to introduce our P3 experts for a presentation on the risks.
Thank you very much, Rahila. I think that was a great introduction to where we are and how we got to where we are. I'm going to now hand this over to Jeremy Moeller. I met Jeremy, I think, in August of 2019 when he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post on why we should be concerned about P3s that I read. And I contacted him and he said, I wrote this to see who would contact me. And I guess we've been in touch since that time. Jeremy is a Maryland resident and his organization itself is a national organization. So I'm going to leave it to Jeremy to tell you all everything that he said so far to me and more on P3s and the risks and rewards around P3s.
Okay, so I'm hoping that my screen is shared. Let me know if it's not. Okay, I see thumbs up. So yes, as Suchitra and Rahila said, my name is Jeremy Moeller. In the public interest, we're a national nonprofit, but I just moved to Baltimore and I grew up in Charles County and had a brief stint in DC, 12 years, before recently moving to Baltimore. So I'm a Marylander basically through and through at this point. Just to add on to kind of explain why we're interested in this and concerned, as you can see from the title here, of the school P3 proposal, we study primarily something called privatization. If you've heard of private prisons or for-profit, privately operated prisons and jails and detention centers, that's something that we study. And in terms of private prisons, we're generally advocating against that. But we study other things like public-private partnerships in infrastructure. You might hear about P3s in water systems, for building roads and bridges, all kinds of other infrastructure. And we'll get into that a little bit more deeply in a second. But the other thing that we look at is public education, making sure that public dollars, taxpayer dollars, are going to educating children and not being siphoned off or used in any sort of private way or being sucked up or siphoned away for private interests. So that's our primary kind of role, is to look at where the public and private come together, and our name says it all. Research, advocate, organize in the public interest. With that being said, I want to kind of tell you what you're going to learn here throughout our part of the presentation and why we're here. Our goal through this segment of the presentation is to explain what P3s are. As you heard from what Rahila was saying, and this is no fault of hers, there's a lot of details. There's a lot of complexity. She did a great job of explaining it, but I know this stuff somewhat, and my eyes were still glazing over just from all the details, right? There's so much, and that's part of the issue here, and the risk is that these things are so complex that it's really hard for us as a public to kind of pay attention to the details. And there's a cliche that gets thrown around a lot: the devil is in the details. And again, we'll dig into that in a second. So I want to get across like what these things are in sort of basic language and understanding. The second thing is I want to lay out the dangers and the risks that are involved. And that is that P3s are more expensive. You're going to hear that a lot tonight. They're also generally more risky than a traditional procurement. And then secretive, or there's a lack of transparency, which is really why we're here talking, because there just hasn't been that much good, solid information released to the public. So that's why we're here trying to figure this out, right? The other one is I'm going to bust a few myths that are thrown around about P3s because they're so new, relatively new, and they're not used in the US as much as in some other countries. So there's a lot of myths and a lot of they're kind of like a shiny, new, innovative thing. So I want to bust some of those myths. And then finally, we'll get to a call to action in terms of what sort of questions you all need to be asking your representatives if you're concerned about this. So moving on, what is a P3? Simply put, a P3 is a form of privatization. As I said before, other forms of privatization are private prisons, where the public hands over control of basically putting people in cages to a private company. We've seen this in immigration detention. For example, a majority of the immigrant detainees at this point are held in privately operated detention centers. So someone is profiting off of putting people in cages. So this is another form of that phenomenon, which we call privatization, where a public good or service is handed over. You're giving control essentially to a corporation or some other private entity. In this case, we're talking about public infrastructure. So not necessarily a detention center or a prison, which is also another form of infrastructure, but we're talking about a school, right? We're talking about a public school. And as Rahila and Suchitra, I believe, said, this would be the first set of public schools in the United States to be built using a P3. So this is new territory. We haven't seen this. We've only seen it in Canada, and I'll talk about some of those deals a little later on. The second thing you should know about a P3 is that they are more expensive. They're more expensive than going the traditional route, which would be using what's called a municipal bond. So if the government, a state and local government or a school district wants to build something like a school, or they want to build a water system or do large improvements to a water system, or fix a bridge or build a new bridge, any sort of infrastructure capital, they're usually going to use something called a municipal bond. And this is also known as public financing. Municipal bonds are really cheap. They're just like taking out a mortgage for a house or any other loan. And you have a really low interest rate on municipal bonds because they're tax exempt from the federal government, from federal taxes. So in this environment where interest rates are very low, I don't know if you've looked into buying a house or have looked at interest rates or heard about them recently. Interest rates in general in our economy right now are very low. So municipal bonds are very cheap. P3s, what is happening essentially is that instead of going through a municipal bond to borrow the money to then build, construct a new school in this case, you're going directly to a financial firm or a bank or some private investors and just borrowing essentially the money directly from them, or they're putting up the capital, the money to build the school in this case. And those investors are only going to give you money if they're going to make a healthy return on their investment. If they only got the interest rate that a municipal bond carries, 1%, 2%, 3%, something low like that, why would they do that, right? You can go to the stock market and invest money and make, I think on average, 8%. So these private investors are going to only going to give money to a local government if they can make a healthy return on their investment, and that makes it more expensive. It's essentially a high interest rate that you're getting with a P3. The next thing I'll mention is that, like I said before, these contracts are really complex, and you're signing a contract in a P3 with a team of corporations, not just the financial firm or bank, not just one construction firm or design firm. They all team up. And in this case, we've got, the financial firm Fengate, we've got Gilbane construction firm, Honeywell for the maintenance piece of it. And then Stantec, I believe, does design and other construction type stuff. So you have this full sort of team that you're signing this very complex, long contract with. And as I said, this is the financial firm is essentially lending the government money at a higher interest rate. Because it's more complex than a traditional procurement, there's even more reason to have more public information out there before taxpayers, the government, sign this contract, right? And we'll get into the very specific information that should be out there. It's called a value for money analysis. Just remember that phrase, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, a little bit more in depth. The last thing I'll say about a P3 is that, and this is a little bit more wonky and complicated, so bear with me, but sometimes local governments have tried to use a P3 to get around basically their debt limit, like how much debt they can have on their books in their budget. So just like a household, you can only borrow so much money, or the bank isn't going to let you borrow any more money to buy another house, right? You already have too much debt. A local and state government has the same, there's a limit. There's basically a limit that they reach that if they go over that, they start to get lower ratings from credit agencies, just like your own credit rating as an individual. And then it's going to cost more to borrow money in the future, right? So in the case of a P3, because they're going directly to a private investors to get the money rather than going through this municipal bond process, some local governments have said, okay, well, then this really isn't debt. Like it's a contract that we have with this set of private investors, this team, and we're just paying every month or every year a certain amount. So it's almost like we're leasing a car, right? And that argument has been made in some places. However, the credit rating agencies have said, no, you can't do that. This is debt because you're signing a contract, in this case, in PG County, 30 years, I think at this point, almost $1 billion. So that needs to show up as debt on your books. You got to account for that, right? You can't pretend that that's a lease payment because you're going to have to pay it back. You owe that money, just like you would with a municipal bond. And then on top of that, there's a third party sort of public facing, or a third party entity, nonprofit called the Governmental Accountability Standards Board. And they recently ruled that local and state governments, that's a standard for them, that they need to count it as debt. So that's all to say that There may have been a reason before to use a P3 to sort of get around this, like sort of a loophole, like I describe in this slide, a technicality to say, oh, it's actually not debt. So that means we can borrow then more money and we're not using up our capital budget and we can use that on other things. That is off the table. That is not essentially legal, or it's not good practice at this point. So there's a lot of justification that a local and state government needs to have to go down this more expensive, this more complex, this more risky route. I'm going to get to next. You might be asking, okay, then why would Prince George's County want to do this, right? Why would any local and state government want to pay more money in something that's more expensive and more risky? Well, one of the reasons is there's an industry out there. There's a P3 industry, private investors, private equity firms, global construction firms, multinational financial firms that have been building up capital and money to try to put it into infrastructure projects because, like I said before, there's a healthy return, right? There's profit to be made. And this is a quote from, this is back in 2008 during the last crisis, right? We're in a crisis again. And this is a chairman, a leader of one of the major financial firms that specializes in P3s. Desperate government is our best customer. There will be a lot of desperate governments out there. So that's all to say that there are people out there that are looking for state and local governments that have infrastructure needs, like Prince George's County, like a lot of state and local governments, need schools to be built, need bridges to be built, roads repaired. And they have money, they have a chunk of money and investment that they want to put into something, and there's money to be made. So they're out there lobbying, they're out there talking to public officials to push public-private partnerships. So that's one reason why a state and local government might want to go down this route, because they have someone in their ear that's telling them that this is very good, right? And this is a way to fill their infrastructure needs. What is do we know anything about Fingate, right? This is the financial firm that's on the team. I hadn't heard of them before when they won this round, where they now are going to be they're the bidder essentially. The little bit that I've been able to find about them is that they are based in Toronto. They specialize in infrastructure and real estate. They primarily have invested in data centers and energy infrastructure. As far as I can tell, they've never invested in a school building, so they don't have any particular experience in this type of infrastructure. And then one of their very few deals in the US, a couple years ago, they bought or invested in the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. And then they recently sold it after the tourist industry was hit pretty hard by COVID, right? So they got out of that business because they saw it kind of going down there. So that's the only thing we really know about them at this point. Private equity firms are generally hard to get information about because they're not publicly traded, or there's not much public information about them. So we don't know a lot about them. And this is basically the business partner that Prince George's County, if they sign this deal, would be working with for the next 30 years. So it'd be nice to know a little bit more about them. All right, so I'm gonna get to the red flags here. As I said before, private investors only invest in infrastructure projects if they're going to be profitable for them, and particularly profitable for them. I wanna give you an example from one of the few places in the world where P3s have been used for schools, for public schools, and this is in Canada. And there are a number of these examples, and there's just too many to name tonight, but the one that stands out to me is that the province of Nova Scotia, this was in 1999, they experimented using a P3 to build, they actually did it for over like 25, 26 schools. So they kind of went all in on this, more than Prince George's County is doing. A decade later, the provincial auditor determined that the public could have saved $52 million if it had gone the traditional route using a municipal bond. So they overpaid for those schools by $52 million. As I said, in a number of other provinces, audits have been done after the fact and shown that the public overpaid, right? That these are in fact very expensive deals. The next thing I wanted to say again is that because the public is overpaying for a P3, and because it is showing up as debt, it does count towards the debt limit for a state and local government. This can crowd out other needs, other infrastructure needs, other schools, right? Or maybe it forces the government to eventually raise taxes more than it would have otherwise, because essentially taxpayers are subsidizing the profits of these private investors, right? They need a healthy return. That money's got to come from somewhere. Sometimes you'll hear people say that P3s are free money. There's no taxpayer money involved. That is absolutely not true, particularly in this model that we're looking at for the school. The money's going to, or excuse me, the money's going to come from somewhere, and it's going to come from you. It's going to come from the county, right? So I wanted to, let's see. I already mentioned the Governmental Accountability Standards Board, right, has already ruled that this has to be debt. The credit rating agencies say that it needs to be debt. So that's already settled. We have heard that folks at the county level are saying that they can get away with not counting it as debt. So that's something that we need to hold them accountable for, and ask them to kind of go on the record about that, because that just simply is not true. The third bullet there, I wanted to talk about risk. And as I said before, the P3s will give these corporations, this team, a lot more leverage than in a traditional procurement. And we see that with the purple line. It's right there in PG County, Montgomery County, and they just walked away. And now the state may have to take it back over, or they are taking it back over. And essentially for the past few months, the team has been holding taxpayers in the state hostage, because they're saying, oh, you owe us more money. There's cost overruns. Here's how much you owe us. If you don't pay us this, we're going to put this on hold, and eventually we're going to walk away. And in a traditional procurement, you might have one construction firm that does that, that's doing the building of the school in this example. And you could say, oh, well, then maybe we'll hire another construction firm. But in this case, you have the financial firm in a P3. You have a financial firm, a construction firm, a design firm, and a maintenance firm. And they've got all kinds of subcontractors. So if they threaten to walk away, that's a big deal. It really can tank the project. I wanted to mention a few other examples outside of the purple line. Last August, Denver International Airport was forced to pay a penalty because they decided to terminate, and this is a $1 billion project similar to in PG County, and a 30-year P3. It's actually very similar. This is right in the middle of the sort of renovation project for the airport. Because of delays and cost overruns. Essentially, it was just a poor job by the team of contractors. So they had the taxpayers actually had to pay a penalty on top of it already being more expensive to get out of the deal, because they were doing a poor job. I won't get into the examples, but a number of these P3s have actually gone bankrupt halfway through. Mike Pence was involved in one in Indiana a few years ago. If you want to go look up that highway, I think it's I-68. It went bankrupt halfway through, and then the state had to run in and take care of it and spend all kinds of money to get it on track. So there's a lot of risk involved. I wanted to get that across. The last thing I'll say, and this one actually is probably the one that bothers me the most, and this is that, you know, these deals are so complex, and it's hard to protect the public for decades in the future. I mean, we're talking about a deal that's going to last 30 years. And this is especially so when you have very little public input or transparency up front, which is the case here in Prince George's County. So what happens is these investors are trying to make money. That's why they're in the deal. And so therefore, they're going to try to write clauses into the contract that essentially guarantee their profits, guarantee their high return on investment. And there's a few examples that have happened over the years that are pretty jaw-dropping to me. One is going back to 2008 in that desperate government quote that you saw there. This was right in the middle of the Great Recession, but Chicago signed a 75-year contract. So this one was really long, with a team of investors and firms to run their parking meters. So basically sold off their parking meters for 75 years. Now in there, among other things, I mean, they sold it off for like $1 billion under value, like they lost money on it, like it's bad. But one of the worst things is that there's a clause in that contract, buried in the details, that requires the city to pay penalties to the investors if certain things happen that adversely impact their profits. So that would be something like if the city wants to hold a fair downtown and they want to block some of the parking meters for a day or two or a weekend, they're going to have to pay a penalty, basically pay off the investors to be able to do that. It adds cost to the fair. If they want to get rid of the parking meters permanently, this is for 75 years, remember that. They want to get rid of them permanently on a road and put in a bike lane or a transit lane. Say we want to get away from a car future, car-centric future and move towards more transit. They're going to have to pay the investors to be able to do that because the investors have locked in their profits, their revenue from these parking meters. When it comes to schools, who knows what that looks like? But in Canada, we've seen some clauses where in the contract, it's written in that teachers can only cover 25% of the walls. And this is in elementary schools. So can you imagine being in an elementary classroom, a second grade classroom, and only 25% of the walls have like student artwork and things that you normally see, right? And most of it's blank. There's other things like they can't open the windows in the school. They have to, the school district has to basically pay money to rent the soccer fields and the other sports fields after school hours from the private investor because they essentially own it. So they're leasing and charging the school district to use a public facility, right? So who knows what's going to be in this contract? And that is even more reason that we need to know the details going in and that the board and the city council need to know what they're signing when they sign this contract. Finally, I know I've spoken a lot here, I've thrown a lot at you. We're going to shift over to Cher. And she's going to talk about a little bit more of the specifics around that value for money analysis piece that I was speaking about.
Okay, thanks so much, Jeremy. So I want to hopefully not make your eyes glaze over even more, but I do want to get into a few of the details because I do think it's important. So one tool that's used to determine whether a government should go with a P3 model or a traditional procurement model is something that is often referred to as a value for money analysis. And what this analysis does is compares the life cycle costs of the project using traditional procurement versus a P3 model. And so this chart that I have up here, I took this chart from a academic that did a review of 28 value for money analyses from Ontario. And one of the reasons why I think, a lot of the examples that Jeremy mentioned were from Canada and a lot of the studies that we have are from Canada is that there just haven't been a ton of public-private partnerships of kind of this variety in the US. There have been more in Canada. And so there's more data and evidence from Canada, which is why we're using, we've looked into some of that data and want to share it. So this academic looked at 28 value for money analyses and he kind of aggregated it. So kind of added it all together and put it on this chart. And so the first column is what these value for money analyses showed for traditional procurement. The second column is what the analysis showed in terms of cost using a P3. And what's interesting is the first thing that you're going to notice is that the blue is the base cost. So how much does it cost to construct this? How much does it cost to maintain it? Like the base costs, including the cost of financing. And you will see here that the traditional procurement, the blue box is smaller than the blue box in the P3. It's cheaper. If you look at the base costs, including the cost of financing, because again, you're using municipal finance instead of the more expensive, the more expensive P3, the more expensive private, finance. It's cheaper. And in fact, the base cost plus the financing on each of these projects was on average 16% lower through a traditional procurement over a P3. Then if you look at the red, that is transaction costs. And as Jeremy mentioned, these are very complex deals. So they require, there's a lot more, you're gonna have to hire a lot more financial firms and legal experts and people like that to look over, stuff, to do the value for money analysis. So it is more expensive. The transaction costs are more expensive in the P3 model when compared to traditional procurement. So if you just look at the blue and the red, it's very clear that the traditional procurement is the more cost-effective option. So you're probably wondering, how do we get to the conclusion that P3s are the way to go when in these analyses? And what they do in this analysis is they basically put together a list of risks. So if the public, if the public entity, if we go the traditional route, these are the risks that are going to, that they're going to be present. So some example from some of, from some of the value for money analyses that we've looked at, things like construction delays, equipment failures, increased operating costs. And they basically make the assumption that the governmental entity is going to not be able to do these as well as the private entity. Therefore, we're going to say that the risk is, they have more risk if we go the traditional procurement model, and we're going to quantify those risks. So they basically, add some numbers to those. How they do it, we're not quite sure, but they kind of add some numbers to it. This is much more of an art than a science. And you'll see the green box under the traditional procurement is much bigger than the green box in the P3. So that's the risk box. That's where they've quantified the risks. And that is how they derive value for money. So that yellow box is how much they say that the P3 model is going to save. But again, this is very much, it's much more art than a science. And I want to just let Rahila, can you just give a little kind of where we are with the value for money analysis?
Sure. Thank you, Shar, for that, and Jeremy as well. Folks, I'm gonna localize this a little bit right now. So in spring of 2019, during a board retreat, the Board of Education was presented with a value for money PowerPoint presentation from a corporation called JLL for a few sets of schools. So they gave us a couple of different options. The value for money, if we did it with these couple of schools, value for money if we did it with these couple of schools. So for 45 minutes to an hour at that meeting, they outlined their findings with us. They had one hard copy packet full of the numerical analysis, it was really thick, that we could look at in that room in that moment, but we weren't provided with copies to take home and review. And to my knowledge, the full value for money analysis isn't publicly available anywhere. But what is important to note now is that the sets of schools that JLL looked at in the value for money analysis are different from the set of schools we're looking at now. Let me say that again. The set of schools that JLL looked at in their value for money analysis in 2019 are different from the set of schools we're looking at now. There is overlap, but they're not all the same. Another thing to note is that significant contributions in the form of technical inputs, risk adjustment assumptions, cost estimates, and financial assumptions were made and provided by PGCPS at that time. And since then, a lot has changed on those fronts. We've been told that they're about rising costs of construction. And Jeremy has mentioned about this new Gatsby ruling that came out and said P3 debt needs to be accounted for in the books of the public entity involved. That's huge. And that's not something that's been accounted for. What I'm saying here is that the 2019 value for money analysis is to my knowledge, not publicly available in its full form, but it's also probably obsolete. And we haven't had an updated value for money analysis for the 5 middle schools and 1 K through 8 school proposed with reflective estimations and assumptions.
That's really important because the details of these deals really matter, and being able to understand how they justify the P3 option being the more cost-effective option is really important. Because as somebody who has analyzed a number of these, again, it's more art than science, and it's very easy to make these analyses, show what you want them to show, and we need to be able to understand their rationale. And so I just want to illustrate what I mean. So Ontario, they did an audit report in 2014. They looked at 75 infrastructure projects that had been delivered using a P3 model. And what they found was that if you looked at the value for money, it predicted that it would be 5 times more risky and therefore more expensive to use traditional delivery method over P3s. That's what the value for money analysis stated. So they went with the P3 route. After these projects had been constructed and they actually had data on them, what they found was that in 74 of the 75 projects, the P3s actually ended up being way more expensive. So to the tune of $8 billion more expensive. So value for money said one thing, but actually what happened was very different. So it's really important to understand how they're used, what their rationale is. And then I think one of the most important parts of this audit report is that the auditor found that there was no empirical data supporting the key assumptions used to assign costs to specific risks. So if you remember in the previous slide, the way that they showed that the P3 option would be cheaper was by assigning monetary value to risks that they said that the public sector would assume if they did use the traditional procurement model. What they found was that there really was no rationale to it, that they could not support the reasons in the method of how they assign costs to those risks, and that just throws the whole model kind of on its head. So I just want to reiterate, it's really important to get a hold of this. And if you go to the next slide, I'll give 2 examples of other P3 projects that we were involved with and worked with local coalitions on the ground, and why the VFM, why the value for money was so important. The first was in Miami-Dade County. There was a water treatment plant that was being proposed to be built using a P3 model. And the coalition analyzed the value for money analysis. They identified a number of issues with that value for money analysis. And so policymakers asked the firm to redo the value for money analysis. The firm actually redid the value for money analysis, taking into consideration some of the coalition and the community's concerns. And when they released the second version of it, under certain scenarios, they actually showed that the P3 option would not save money. And that just raised a lot of doubts around using a P3 model, and they decided not to actually go down that route. One other example, in Indianapolis, the city was considering using a P3 model to build a criminal justice facility. And advocates analyzed that value for money analysis, and they raised a lot of questions. And the city council actually hired a CPA to evaluate that value for money analysis that they received. So they hired somebody to kind of double check the math. And when that person that they hired kind of double checked the math, they kind of came up with the opposite answer. They said, no, actually the P3 isn't going to save money. And again, that it raised a lot of doubts. And for that and for some other reasons, they ended up kind of putting that project on hold. So just understand the math, being able to double check it. These are all really important things that other cities, other counties, other localities have done. And I'm going to hand it back off to Jeremy.
Thank you, Cher. So we've said a lot. We've thrown a lot at you here. Even as I was talking about it, my eyes were glazing over. So I'm going to try to boil this down to some of the key points here in terms of where we should go from here. And then I think Suchitra and Rahila and others are going to kind of even narrow it down and make it even more specific. So what is that underlying math? We need to see the value for money analysis, and we need to make sure it justifies paying a lot more for a P3. We just have to see it. It's been seen in other places. We need to see it here. How was the timeline for the traditional method? 12 years. This is what the district and the county are saying, is that it would take 12 years if they used a traditional municipal bond to build a school. And why can't we do it faster? What's the issue? And that's what Rahila was kind of getting at in the beginning. And then I think I really want to underline something that Rahila said earlier on about the process. And there are a lot of pieces to this, but there's this abnormal thing, this weird, really kind of dangerous aspect to the process that's happening very fast right now. We're right in the middle of it, where the school board and the council are going to vote on this in the coming weeks. But they're going to vote on not a final contract. They're going to vote on basically a summary of the final contract. It's not going to have the specific details, even the final cost. And certainly not the clauses that I was talking about earlier, the specific clauses that might end up in this that limit what teachers can do, what school staff, what others can do in the building, and how the public can use these buildings, right? They're not gonna be able to see those details, but they're still gonna be signing away the power, and they're your representatives, right? So the public is only gonna really have one swing at the ball here coming up, and then it's off to the races. So the questions are, how is this going to impact the district's budget for 30 years? How is it going to impact the county budget? How is it going to impact the state budget, if at all? And then, like I said, are there going to be clauses in there that are come back to bite the public down the road? How much of the capital, or how much risk is the county and the district taking on going this path with the purple line that just happened? There's so many questions that are really, really important to get asked, like now, before the board and the county have to vote on this. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to shoot it over to Suchitra, I believe.
So I did have a few questions for Rahila and Shar and Jeremy, just to wrap my head around this. And the first is, so when was the last time, I mean, we've been hearing also on the chat that it takes a very long time to build a school. And even now we're hearing it takes 10 years to build a school. When was the last time the capital projects was audited to understand why it is that it takes us so long to do this? And can we move faster? So for instance, if 6 middle schools are proposed in the current round for the P3, what happens if we do the 6 middle schools by using public bonds and doing them just as efficiently as a private entity would do? I mean, wouldn't that be one way of looking at it?
Suchitra, that's an excellent question. The answer is, I don't know. I know that the state does some evaluation of this on, I don't know if it's a 5-year basis or something like that, but to have an audit that specifically looks at, this is the project that we started with, this is the evolution of that project, how that project has changed, how did the budget grow, what was the original timeline, where did we end up? I don't know that I can say that I've seen that ever happen on a project by project basis.
Okay, because my thinking was, if we are lacking in some level of expertise in the county, we should be building up that level of expertise, and maybe an audit will reveal what it is we need to do to build up that level of expertise. And I did also want to go back to the GASB ruling that was mentioned. So is it that if we issue this private debt, basically $1 billion in debt will show up on our books, and that makes it harder for us to borrow more money? Is that what you're saying, Jeremy? Shar?
Yeah, can you confirm, is it the total one, like the total amount that shows up on the books, or is it like a yearly thing? Do you know?
So it's the amount that goes toward the capital expense. So the amount in the availability payments that the district would be paying, a portion of that goes toward the operations and maintenance aspect of it. And then but the bigger portion goes toward the capital costs. And so any part that goes toward the capital cost, which is the majority of the availability payment, must be booked as debt.
Right. And then to get to the heart of your question, Suchitra, I think it's the point I was making is that essentially the interest rate the profits, the return that's going to the investors, the financing piece of that, that's more money or more, that's taking up more space in this capital budget than if you went with the traditional route.
Right. So if we issued our own bonds to build schools, to build 6 middle schools, we might find ourselves actually spending a lot less if we could if we could figure out how to make that happen. And I think in a previous conversation with Shar, she was saying that you could put all these constraints into contracts that you issue yourself, the county issues to a builder, for instance, to say you have to do this within 4 years or you face a penalty. I mean, so a penalty for not completing it on time, an incentive for doing it earlier. All these that go into the P3 contract can just as easily be done by the county to a private builder without going into the risk of borrowing the capital privately.
That's correct. There are definitely ways of designing contracts, and I think if the construction firm that was part of this bidder team, you could even, if they were a really good, I don't know much about them, but if they were a really good construction firm, you can sign a separate contract with that construction firm and provide incentives for them to do it within a given timeline. There are ways, there's details to be figured out, but there are definitely ways to do that. And I'm sure if this, there's a lot of construction firms that regularly build schools, and I'm sure they all, that using the traditional procurement method, and there's, timelines that they have to adhere to. So that's not abnormal to have timelines in construction contracts.
Thank you. So I think I'd like to bring the rest of before we get to the call for action, to bring the rest of the panelists into the conversation. So Jeremy, if you could not share your screen for a minute and we could have everybody there. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I would like to kind of reach out to, so first of all, apologies. When I did the introduction, I left out our most junior member on the panel, and that is Alvaro Ciron. He is from Eleanor Roosevelt High School. He's a 10th grade student, and he is on the advisory board for the student member who is on the school board. Right, I hope I got that right. So I wanted to ask each of you, and I'll go around and say, I mean, you're all community activists, very energetic in your own right. I'm going to go around and ask each of you what you thought of this presentation and your ideas on where we stand now. So maybe I'll start with Crystal, since she's the first person that I see on my screen.
Yeah, just thank you for putting this together and for the presentation. It was really informative, even as someone that's familiar with somewhat with P3s. I learned a lot more from this presentation than I knew coming in. I think a comment in question, to better understand what we've learned, right, from P3s that like with highway construction, or even what we're seeing in Canada with other schools. So have we started to form, or your organization, like recommendations that if you're going to go this route, these are the types of amendments that close loopholes that end up costing more money on the back end? Because since these are simple contracts, just trying to understand what we could be demanding is included that wouldn't put us in the same positions that a lot of these other projects have been put in.
I can take a crack at that, and then Jeremy, you can feel free to add anything. I mean, what I will say is that the easiest time to make the best decisions is at the beginning. And so, just being able to do the due diligence and making sure this isn't a rushed process, I think is the most important thing. And, right now, considering that there's documents that haven't been made public, that there's been, that there's no kind of, they're going to be voting on a summary of a contract, not the actual kind of contract and all of its, hundreds of pages glory. It just seems like right now would be the time to kind of slow things down, get more information, and then make a decision. But just have a few, you know, have a little bit more time to actually make sure you're making the right decision off the bat before, you know, getting yourself into a 30-year contract that may be problematic. You know, we definitely do have recommendations for how to ensure that contracts are, you know, more kind of in the public interest. I will say that, you know, when you start adding more requirements onto these contracts, you pay for it. So the contract will become more expensive. So if you're going to say, you know, look, we're going to ensure that the school, you know, teachers can do whatever they want with their classrooms, that, you know, that we're going to have control over all these maintenance issues, whatever it is, those are going to be things that are going to end up costing the district because it's control that the private partner is giving up. And so basically, the more conditions you set on the private entity, the higher the price is going to be. So it's, you know, there's that balancing act of, you know, kind of you're adding costs if you want to make it into a contract that, you know, that closes some of those loopholes. And so that's why I say it's, you know, it's the best time to make sure you're making the right decisions kind of at the beginning instead of trying to do a rush job of amending a contract right before it's going to be approved. Jeremy, anything to add to that?
Nothing to add. That was great.
And two more questions, and I'll pass it on. Just for clarification, when you talked about the value for money analysis, is that internally done by the organization built, like bidding for the contract? Like, who actually does that analysis?
So it's typically a firm, like a financial firm. And in this case, Rahila, can you give just a little bit of background on who did the one for this project?
The value for money analysis was done by JLL.
Who's part of the contract? Or no?
No.
They were just bidded separately. Their only part in this whole thing is doing this values for money analysis.
That was my understanding, yeah.
That's helpful.
I
And
think
then
they're
last question.
consulting. They're consulting through the process of it. I don't think it was just the value for money, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think
They're
they were
not part of
brought
the
in
board.
to advise the council on getting into a P3. So just to piggyback on that, how common is it that this value for money analysis is not public? I mean, does that happen in other places, or is?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, you know, the places that we have worked, we've never had any problems getting a hold of the value for money analysis, you know, and you know, advocates on the ground and you know, concerned community members. That's always been made public, you know, pretty early on in the process.
And is that right now not public because it's people are refusing to release it? Or I don't know if you, Rahila, have any information about why that's not public.
I cannot, the simple answer to that is I don't know. The longer answer is that I'd mentioned before that it was the full packet at that board retreat. They had one copy, and we did not get take-home packets to be able to look at that. So I cannot answer that question.
And one last question, I'll pass it on to other people that want to ask questions. Just understanding like stipulations around, because there's a lot of money, right, if we go down this route, but ensuring like who gets contracts. We obviously saw our track record. We've lost millions upon millions of dollars in overpaying for projects. But then just making sure that these type of contracts, what does that look for, like minority business owners and union labor? Has that already been discussed? Is that part of these agreements, or what would that look like?
There is a set aside for minority and local owned businesses to be a part of this project. I think it's 30% or 40%. So there is that stipulation. I think of this entire project, that's probably the part that I like the most. There's one thing where I was like, okay, that was, we probably did that one right. That's it.
But just out of curiosity, because I've seen like at board meetings where the board has been allowed to vote to override the actual percentage for minority businesses because they say that they could not meet the standard. Is that the case too? Like this 30% isn't really 30%. It can be voted on later and be amended where the 30% doesn't actually come to fruition.
I'm pretty sure, Crystal, that the resolution that my colleagues voted on in September of last year had that amount, that number in there. And that was a big, what you've mentioned was a big reason for that. Having said that, you know, any motion of the board can be changed with another motion of the board. So.
Appreciate it. And then what about the union labor? That's stipulated?
I don't think that union labor was stipulated in that resolution, no.
Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. So I'm going to ask Martin if he has questions to ask. I know he has to leave sooner. So Martin, if you have anything you'd like to ask.
Yes, I apologize. I fell off during the line of questions. But basically, I know Crystal brought up a lot of things that I was interested in. Are there like ways to kind of get in front of like some of these loopholes in the contracts? That was kind of my initial question. And then I guess, you know, I do share the teacher's question. Is it, from my understanding, you know, the school building process, as far as the traditional way, has been like very slow. And of course, I do understand the concerns with, you know, the private partnership. Clearly, you know, there's been many examples of, you know, bad partners. But specific to this one, I just wanted to know if we were to go to the traditional, like obviously Rahila, I guess she said she doesn't know, but if we were to go the traditional route for these 6 schools, what timeline would we be looking at, as opposed to, I guess this, because they were saying 6 years as opposed to 12, right? Is that correct?
So the numbers have been different in different places. In one place I saw that, okay, it takes 10 years to build a school. Another place it says 12 years to build a school. So I think that that final number is variable based upon where you look. The contract that's being brought before the board is basically saying build these 6 schools within this 3 to 4 year time. At the end of 4 years, all those 6 schools should be built. The issue, though, Martin, is that there is a piece of this this contract where if the developer doesn't build it by that time period, there's a penalty. That penalty is $1 million per school. $1 million in a nearly $1 billion project. So do the math, carry the one, that's 0.1% of that project is the penalty for a school not being built on time. And I don't know about the rest of the folks on this call, but that doesn't give me any sense of security that these schools would be built at the speed at which our community really wants this to happen. So there's that piece of that too.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point.
This is Cher. I'll just add that I think these are really important questions to ask, and kind of there's been some numbers around numbers of years kind of thrown around, 12 years, 10 years, you know, versus 4 years with the P3 model, but it's unclear kind of how those, you know, kind of exactly how those figures were derived. And so again, it's just, you know, asking these important questions and really understanding the, you know, kind of the rationale, and you know, should be a really important part of this process.
So I'm just reminded in this conversation of Jeremy's slide talking about desperate governments. I think, you know, we can't be a desperate government forever. I think we really need to fix things internally, because otherwise, basically, businesses come and take advantage of us if we're not competent. So I think that's the phrase that sort of is revolving in my mind right now. And I'll pass it on to Dave Kahn. Dave is representing the Prince George's Civic Federation a longtime county activist. So it's all yours, Dave.
Thank you. And I want to thank Jeremy and Shore for an excellent presentation. As Jeremy mentioned, the danger is in the details. And I think we need to know a lot more about the details. Among other things, talk that 30% MBE requirement. Who knows what's in that negotiation document? It hasn't been shared with us. And the winning proponent supposedly won strictly on cost, not on the quality of their proposal. And they rank ordered all the responsive proposals. We don't know how many there were. Took the cheapest one, that's what the RFP says, and now they're going to negotiate. But we don't know what they're negotiating on. Can the price change? Can the percentage of minority business change? Maybe they'll put a clause in there that they'll negotiate that if the developer shows that they attempted to get minority businesses, that can come down to whatever, to zero, who knows? But I got two words for this whole scheme. I don't know if any of you were around in 2008 and 2009. My two words for this are Washington Plaza. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but the school board entered into a what amounted to a 30-year lease, which was nothing more than a financing scheme. And this is, by the way, this one is not a real public-private partnership. It's alternative financing. It's a way to use private financing instead of public financing, because the developer is not, the only risk the developer is assuming is its own failure to comply with the contract. It's not sharing the risk at all like you do with a revenue project. But in Washington Plaza, it cost us over $4 million to get out of the contract, just like happened in Canada, what was being talked about earlier. We sunk a lot of money into it, and then we had to pay to get out of what amounted to a bad contract. And by the way, it was our legislature who finally agreed that the contract was a bad one. The real essence of Washington Plaza, why it existed, was the ability to use operational funds appropriated to the schools to pay for capital costs. In other words, funds that are aimed at the classroom instead are going to be used to build classrooms. I don't know about you, but the teachers, we need more teachers, more supplies. We need more money in the classrooms, not less money. And I've been trying to get answers, and nobody seems to have the answers about where our tax money is going to come from. We have the county taxes, their share is $10 million a year, and the district share of $10 million. Is that coming out of operations? It pretty much has to. So if we're going to beggar our students and take money away from the teachers and away from the classroom to build buildings, that's wrong. It doesn't even matter if it saves money, it's still wrong. We can't afford that. If this is such a good deal, then the money should be appropriated to the capital budget, and the operational budget should be left untouched. Now, I can't tell, and I hope somebody someday comes up with an answer as to how they intend to finance this, but if it's out of the operational fund, I'm against it regardless of how much we save. We can't afford to take more money out of the classrooms. Then there's trim. This is going to require, starting in 2024, an increase in taxes to make these availability payments. Now, that's $20 million a year coming out of county taxes. What's that going to do? Is it going to bump up against trim? Is it going to hurt people who are already hurt and still may be suffering by them from this pandemic and the loss of jobs and small businesses? That's not being taken into consideration. When you talk about risk, those are risks that are really real to people. And this whole idea of the risk being shown and the value for money, that's a big fudge factor. We need to see that and what risks that our contractor has used to make the public financing more expensive than the private financing in value for money. It looks to me like you can easily decide where you want that number to come out and then put in enough risks to justify the figure. I don't know anything about JLL or whatever the name of the contractor was, but that should be public. So should the proposals be public. So should the negotiating form. The district under the RFP has to send the winning bidder a negotiating form to propose what should be negotiated. The bidder sends it back with its ideas, the school signs off on it, and then they negotiate. What are they negotiating? Are they negotiating things that will be to our detriment? We don't know. And unless and until there's a heck of a lot more known, unless we know that money is not going to come out of the classroom, I'm against this, even if value for money shows that the private financer will be cheaper. And I'm not anti-privatization in all cases, but I sure am in this one.
Thank you, Dave. I think that's a good summary of the history of what has happened and how we have found ourselves in the wrong place and why we are in fact sitting here advocating for openness and clarity. We're not sitting here saying that schools are not needed. We're just saying, let's do the best we can. So with that, I wanted to give Alvaro Ruiz a chance to ask any questions that he may have to the panelists, and then we'll go to Jana.
Alrighty, thank you. Thank you for having me. And my first question was going to be, just for clarification, what schools are the ones to be impacted by this plan?
So Alvaro, there are 5 middle schools and 1 K-8 academy. I will put them in the chat box for everybody to see.
Okay, so is it solely construction of schools, or does it also involve renovations?
It's the construction of those 6 schools.
Okay. And what, if any, is the control or power this partner can have over those schools?
Could you repeat that, Alvaro?
Yeah, I said, what, if any, is the control or power the partner can have over these new schools?
I mean, I think the issue is that, to the point of the exclusive negotiating agreement, we won't know until they go through that period and discuss a lot of those terms of what power does this person have, what is their ability to do this, and what is our ability to do this. And so some of it is up in the air when it comes to that. I will also put in the chat box, I'll take a look and I'll find it, the public presentation that was given by PGCPS in August on this, so that it'll provide some more details of what they were initially thinking of as of a couple months ago.
Right. And what, if anything, can be done to stop this plan as of this moment? Because I know that a lot of deadlines are coming up.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There is a call for action, I think, Suchitra, that Suchitra had mentioned earlier, and so I'll leave it to Suchitra to mention it when it's appropriate to do so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So Jana.
Suchitra, I'm so sorry. Can I ask Alvaro a question?
Sure.
I don't know if it's appropriate. Alvaro, you tell me. I think from a student perspective, are there any concerns that you have for what this could look like for you and your peers down the line? Like, honestly, y'all will be the ones to be paying for this long after many of us are gone. And so what are your feelings around this?
Yeah, so as was mentioned, I'm a part of this SMOB Advisory Council, but I've also been a part of the student government for Prince George's County. And one of the positions I've served is middle school advocate. And I was able to visit different schools and see the current state they are like Nicholas Orem. And I bring this up because when we see these schools and the state they are, we tend to think, well, let's fix it and whatever it takes. But as a student, I'm urging that this isn't the way we could do it. The P3 is not the best plan we can. In my personal perspective, having the luxury of going to a state-of-the-art school does not match that of having to find ways to pay off this 1 billion in the next 30 years. And just that, I don't think that my generation should be affected and possibly have to face raised taxes just to have something be done faster, in quotes, because not guaranteed. And so from the student perspective, I see that this plan is not the best. And I'd much rather have the county look for a different approach than dive into this contract that could affect my fellow students and the community for the next 30 years. That's all.
Thanks, Alvaro.
Thank you. So Jana, it's all yours.
Yes, it's pronounced Jana. No
Jana.
worries though.
Okay.
So I was listening to the entire presentation and taking notes, but I've been actually actively looking at the comments in the chat. There are a couple of things that were said that I feel like need to be addressed. So I'm going to take it from that perspective. First off, just to clarify, the county council and the county executive work for myself and the other constituents. And while I can appreciate what they deem or feel is appropriate, I can also say that when there is extreme pushback or there is pushback or there's a lack of transparency, there should be a discussion around that, right? This whole process has been highly publicized with so much lack of transparency. And it astounds me that there are so many people that have no answers to a lot of very important questions and are still pushing the P3. And when we talk about our elected officials, who I have honor for in the capacity that people voted for them, I would like to point out that there are several things that the constituents of Prince George's County have pushed back on and have asked to be changed that the county council and county executive deemed were appropriate. For example, most recently, the fact that they were going to put on the ballot a question that would raise taxes by almost 10%. So I'm not really sold on using the judgment solely of the county council or the county executive when it comes to things that are going to impact my bottom line for about 30 years. There was a statement about Alvaro graduating from school, and let's be clear, a lot of Prince George's County residents who graduate from this school system remain in this area. They continue to pay taxes in this area. If you do send your child to a private school, you're still paying taxes in a public school system, and you're still impacted by the people that are in this public school situation. So to even imply that this would not affect him or affect the residents that will be living here for another 30 years is tremendously inappropriate, just on its face. Also, it's really funny that there is not a historical perspective put on this. When you talk about Prince George's County and how we are unable to pay for new schools, no one's talking about how the state has underfunded us for almost 30 to 40 years. So much so that they actually did not build schools, which led to litigation, and where the state of Maryland has a financial obligation to build schools within Prince George's County. Why isn't the state of Maryland fulfilling that financial obligation instead of the state and legislators pushing us to go into a private public partnership, and where the bill would be left upon Prince George's County residents, right? So like when we talk about these things, like there should be more of that. And that was from a litigation that was brought from a lawsuit in relation to the NAACP. And if you want someone else who can speak at length on that, our school board chair, Dr. Alvin Thornton, knows about that litigation in depth. So, and that's just because, and I love Dr. Alvin Thornton. That's not a shot. He's amazing. He's one of my favorite people to listen to for hours on end. But it's to say that there are people who have in-depth knowledge of these different issues. So when you talk about it from the perspective of Prince George's County can't build schools within 10 years, but Prince George's County has been underfunded for over 40 years, then let's have that conversation, right? Okay, let's have that. And yes, we do have to put money into the schools that we already have to get up the maintenance process. If you want to do a P3 with this public-private partnership, then let none of the funding come from any of the Prince George's County Public School budget. Let's talk about that. Or let's talk about how right now we're at a maintenance of effort, and we probably will still be at a maintenance of effort, which means they're not going to increase public school funding for Prince George's County, and Prince George's County has been underfunded for years. Oh, Lou, I'm saying that Prince George's County has been underfunded for years because there have been two big ones, the Thornton Commission and the Curran Commission, that shows that Maryland schools as a whole have been underfunded for several years because they didn't actually fund the Thornton Commission. And then the Curran Commission came back and showed that because they didn't fund the Thornton Commission, that now we are severely underfunding our schools as a whole, as Maryland as a whole. Subsequently, Prince George's County public schools are underfunded. I did my research before I came on the call. Okay, so when we talk about these things, right, we're not talking about not providing Prince George's County public school systems with new schools. That's not what we're against here. We're against this method that is extremely lacking transparency, is moving at a very high rate, that is taking away Maryland's responsibility to provide certain amount of funding to Prince George's County for school construction, as well as that it's about to be this done right here without actually any of the public knowing. And like, there were real serious concerns that were brought through this presentation that no one is addressing. The fact that teachers might not be able to do anything within the schools, that it might be restricted on several things, that they could put in extra financial things that could make our whole tab on this thing a lot more. I don't know about you, but I intend on living for more than 30 more years in Prince George's County. So I don't want to have to pay for this for 30 years and then some. All we're saying at this point is from this presentation, there have been serious questions brought up about the process, about the motives of the people supporting the process, and how we can get transparency within this process if they do intend to move forward, right? And then put as much in place to protect the citizens and constituents of Prince George's County from a financial point. Like from a financial point, I'm so concerned as how everyone is missing this. But these will be not these and not you specifically, but it'll be the same people that will come and say, I don't want my taxes raised. What you think is gonna happen when you put a P3 in here and they gotta pay for these fundings, but you only are charging somebody $1 million when they don't stay on schedule. And since we're talking about it, the county council voted that developers didn't have to pay their fair share about school construction. So we have developers making millions and millions of dollars within Prince George's County that don't pay their fair share. But you want me as a taxpayer to pay into this $1 billion P3 thing for 6 schools? Yeah. Okay. I don't have any questions. Thank you. Ciao.
Hey, Jana. So I do have some thoughts that came up as you spoke, and I wanted to see if I could put those forward with you. And that is, the text amendments that constantly push areas of the county that are not meant to be developed, and to push development there, and then to require schools in these areas. And as you said, the developer exemptions to the school construction budget that's supposed to come from them. And then these facts that we learned when we were talking about the homestead tax increase that was proposed in July, when we learned that we pay the highest in property and income taxes in the state of any county, that we are while we are the wealthiest minority county in the entire country, we rank 16th out of 23 counties in Maryland in income and wealth. So that just shows you, how little wealth people of color have and how little income they have relative to, the big base outside. And therefore, it seems to me that we ought to be very, very careful with the tax dollars that we collect and the tax dollars that we spend. And having this lack of transparency is really problematic because we're not doing justice to the money that we collect from the people we're collecting from.
Teacher, I just want to bring up, I can just even bring up a more recent thing that happened. I don't know if anyone had followed the Westphalia development and where they were trying to put an Amazon warehouse in Westphalia, right? And they had an agreement with that particular development and the people that had bought into that development. And there was a quote when a community meeting with the developers who were trying to push this Amazon warehouse in a residential, right, area. And he initially had promised, the developers had promised to provide the development a library and a school. And this was what the people who lived there, the residents, brought up over and over again, right? And as they brought that up, he said, oh, well, we don't know if Prince George's County has the capacity to maintain a school, so we're not going to build a school. Even though they had already promised the people that were moving into these developments and buying into these houses that they were going to build a school for their children and their family for the upcoming years, right? They put it right back on the school system. The school system came back and said, we have never had any conversations with these developers about what we're able to maintain. But this is something that they promised the residents, and then, we would be able to take it over as Prince George's County. This is the type, right, of shenanigans that we have, or double speaking or double talking or putting on one and putting on other, that we have with developers who work within our county. And we're now being told that we should trust these same developers to not tack on any additional costs, we're writing them a blank check. And then we're saying, oh, but we trust y'all. I don't understand that. And I think the most frustrating, 5 schools were proposed. See, they only spoke about one. But the frustrating part about me is that at the minimum, I don't understand why there's not more outrage about transparency and about the transparency around funding that is going to come from your tax dollars for 30 years in relation to a school project that is only giving you 6 schools. And it's a blank check, right? At the minimum. And I'm astounded by that at the minimum. I most definitely want my students within Prince George's County to have new schools. I worked at Nicholas Orem. I worked in a trailer at Nicholas Orem. And I walked out and there was rain coming into my classroom. So I am not unaffected or have not been affected by what my students need in Prince George's County. And I do feel like this conversation is important because it's about balancing what your students need versus being responsible with taxpayer dollars and the taxpayer checkbooks, and being transparent with the funds that you're given. And I heard the conversation that was given in there about talking about the minority-owned businesses within Prince George's County. Let's be clear. Prince George's County can give massive contracts to any minority business that they want to. If you have been coming to the school board meetings as I have, you would have seen that Sonia Williams spoke on several instances in where, quote unquote, Prince George's County doesn't have the capacity as it relates to minority owned businesses to do the things that we need done on a large scale. This is why we need to operate outside of that. And yet now they're toting, oh, well, when we have Honeywell, we have this, we're going to have a whole bunch of subcontractors to the minority businesses within Prince George's County. So how is it that when you do this $1 billion thing, you can have all these subcontractors to minority businesses, but those same minority businesses aren't good enough to do it through a public bond or whatever it is that we're talking about here that would be outside of a P3. Why are we asking those questions? And not to say that there might be an answer for, there might be a very valid answer for that. It might be that, hey, Honeywell can do this and these subcontractors can take over that. I'm not even saying that there's not a valid answer. But what I am saying is that there's a lot of conversation from this, and I've heard what the school board members have said. And a lot of this is definitely not really aligned with this. This is a serious thing. This isn't just, oh, let's put it on here like, oh yeah, it's okay, because we're gonna get 6 schools. 6? The average, the average age of the school buildings within Prince George's County is 53 years. Why isn't it being roped in here about how to properly fund maintenance for the other 200 something schools in Prince George's County to get them up to code? Come on, y'all. Like, we're not trying to not get schools for Prince George's County. That's not what we're saying. We're saying is that this needs to be really looked at. And it seems like the train is already leaving the station. Like, the train is already leaving the station, and guess who's going to be stuck with the bill?
So on that note, Jaina, the train is already leaving the station. Is it or is it not? And what can we do? I think this is the time for us to do our call for action, because we can either sit back and say, oh my God, what do? We should have done something earlier. We should have done something last year, or we can get up and do something now. I'm going to ask everyone to go now while we are here on the call. And after we finish the call for action, we will go to questions from the audience. I'm asking you to go to this website, and I'm going to put it in the chat as well. Let me see if I can get this on the chat. But if you go to this site, basically, there will be a sample letter. You put your name in there. You take a look at the draft that's in there. If you like it, just send it as it is. If you want to change it, then go ahead and change it and click send. And it will go to the county executive, the entire county council, and the entire school board. So I'm asking you please to go now and send this out. We'll give everybody a few minutes to get to that and do it. If you have questions, just put it in the chat, and I will get this and see if I can put the link in the chat as well. So you should be able to copy it from the chat and paste it. And Rahila will tell you if she gets a copy of this email. So
give live updates, y'all. Live.
if you have any questions, put them in the chat about this action and if you're able to get to it or not. So while you're doing that, and Rahila will keep us updated on how that's going, I will take a few questions from the Q&A and put them out there. So somebody said, have we learned anything from the purple line situation? Are there any thoughts? I know there was a webinar on that, simultaneously with our webinar here. But I was wondering, Jeremy, Shar, do you have any thoughts on what happened? I know there were contractor overruns of $800,000. That's what I read, but beyond that.
Unfortunately, I don't know the details on that other than there's been overruns, there's been delays for months now. The team of contractors basically held up the project for a while now, saying that they were demanding more money. And when the state pushed back on that and they got into the kind of negotiations and debates about that for a while, eventually the team walked away from the project. And that happened recently.
So somebody's asking, has PGCPS contracted with a construction management firm to represent their interest? I mean, I don't think we've gone anywhere beyond getting JLL to advise us on the P3, right? I don't think there's been any further conversation about that. So I guess a question for Dave, maybe. It says, is it possible to have more virtual conversations with civic groups and others? So maybe the Civic Federation could invite civic groups to a conversation, or we could, we could think of how to do that. I know there's a coalition that came together around this webinar and this issue, and you see the members of the coalition listed on the call to action. But I'm sure, I mean, our discussion today is live on the Facebook page for Our Revolution PG County chapter. We will go there and see what questions there are as well and answer them. You can put more questions in that chat as well. And anywhere we find questions, I think we're all ready to go back and answer them if we can get it done today. So are you getting any emails in yet, Rahila?
I have 23 and counting.
That's excellent.
To answer your question, we have quite a few civic associations that are members of the Prince George's County Civic Federation. Our meetings, which are now on Zoom, are open to the public, and if anybody would want to attend or say something to us or join us, I'd be happy to get them an invitation. I can put my email in the chat, and feel free to contact me.
Thank you. So Sydney Jacobs is asking whether there's any information about specific potential contractors, where they're based, are they multinational corporations, and what profit margins do they typically expect from investing in our schools? So kind of a general question.
As I mentioned, we actually don't know that much about the financial firm named Fengate. I think Fengate Capital Management. We do know that they're based in Toronto. They have primarily Canadian investments, although they have a few US investments. So they are a multinational private equity firm. We don't know anything about their margins or their profits because they're a private company. They're not a publicly traded company. So they don't have to release public information about those sorts of things. And they also aren't a big name that at least I've seen in the P3 industry so far. And as I mentioned before, as far as I'm aware, they have not invested in and built any or funded or financed any public infrastructure, public schools. So this would be their first school project. I don't know about the other companies. I think Gilbane does some local work, and yeah, Honeywell is obviously a very big company.
So there's a question on the chat saying, is the letter going to everyone listed? And yes, it goes to everyone listed. You don't have to, if you want, you can pick and choose, but you don't have to. I think you can just send it to everyone. So Amity is following up on the question that Sydney asked and saying, is this something like a subprime mortgage? It sounds like it. If so, seems like the schools will be vulnerable to close its doors if the local government couldn't make the annual payment.
But we have seen one thing to consider is that this is a contractual obligation. So these payments are contractually obligated, which is why a big reason why the credit ratings agency and then GASB has now determined that these should indeed be booked as debt on the books. So if availability payments aren't paid, if the district does not pay those availability payments, the contractor, the private entity, can and does and absolutely has grounds to sue the school district and get those availability payments plus any other damages. I mean, this is contractually, binding, and, and because it's contractually binding, they, they would have every right to go to court, and a judge would likely rule that the district would have to make those payments plus any damage, plus any damages. So just understand that, this is contractually binding, and there is legal recourse if the district does not make those availability payments.
There's a question about what interest rate will we be paying for the P3 contract. I guess maybe framing that differently to say what kind of returns do private investors typically expect for P3 projects?
Sure.
Yeah,
do you think it's okay to mention that data that we had?
I'll just, just generally, I'd say generally we've, anywhere from depending on kind of how the project is structured, anywhere from 10 to, anywhere from 10 to 20%. Is that right, Jeremy? Kind of what we've seen and kind of been told. Are my numbers correct?
I think it was 10 to 25 actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it really depends on it really depends on a lot of variables. And the other thing I will say is this is why it's really important to see the value for money analysis. And if those types of numbers aren't included, kind of estimates of cost of financing and other types of ways that other types of kind of ways that they would make money, that needs to be included in the analysis. So again, these are numbers we should be asking for to better understand what they're proposing.
So yeah, I want to tell a little story about today when Jeremy Moeller and I were speaking to Tracy Wilkins from NBC4, and she reminded us that the South Campus dorm at the University of Maryland is a public-private partnership. And the students who signed a contract with the South Campus dorm in February and now are not coming to the university are finding it very difficult to get off their contracts. And whereas the students who are in the university dorms are just let off their contracts because it's a public university and the public university is not meeting in person. So these students, apparently 100 of them, have filed a class action suit. Some of them are getting letters from doctors saying they have concerns that may make them more susceptible to COVID. And I think NBC4 has done 3 stories on this, and that's a public-private partnership. And it's just, it seems like if we can possibly go the public route and shore up our public organizations, our government structures, it is a far healthier way to go than to simply say, we can't do it and please come and do it for us, and appeal to large profitable corporations.
And I want to talk about this really quickly because there are facts I just don't want people to not have out there. Just recently, within this past year, there is I don't know the exact number, but I think it's around $500,000 that's going to a private school to build a whole science and tech building in District Heights. Guess who's paying for that? Because that was from our legislators. It's I believe it's Bishop McNamara. They did a groundbreaking and everything. Our taxpayer dollars are going to build a whole building, facility, wing, whatever it is, at a private school. I hope y'all got that same energy. I mean, if they can send that money to build a whole wing building at a private school in Bishop McNamara, look it up on your district. They did a whole big presentation. They did a shovel, groundbreaking and everything. But we don't have enough money to take maintenance of effort or maintenance to take to these schools in Nicholas Orem and build a new wing for Nicholas Orem. That's a public school, but we're using public funds to build this whole private school wing. Y'all, okay.
I think what's important that's been brought up, I think, just to elevate, especially us on this call and everyone listening, that want to advocate for what we can do to make sure that we do, because like I think Parker mentioned, like we all want schools built. We all want adequate schools built. We have schools where kids can't even use the water fountains, right? Like that was just fixed like a year ago. They had to use water bottles because of lead poisoning, right? So I think we can all agree that sadly there's schools in Prince George County that are just not meeting the mark. But I think the auditing process internally on new construction and maintenance has to be part of the conversation, because we are bleeding out money, right? And because what got us to this even point of trying a different method is that we can all agree the current method also does not work, right? How much money was stolen or mismanaged, or we overcharged, what was it, $85 million? Excuse me if my figures are wrong there, but I think Keely is like, how do we audit this process so that we can do it internally better? I think it's super important. It has to be part of the dialogue. Even if we went through this route of P3 and that's where we ended up, if we don't learn about this process and how they can do it better, how they can manage it better, and internalize that into our own processes so that we can do it at a lower rate, I feel like that has to be even the end goal here. Because I think we can all agree the end goal is that we find a way to create safe spaces for our children to learn, and that we do it in the most accountable way to residents and the money that we're paying out. And I think that's what we're all at a crossroads where we know that's not happening currently. And we're all trying to figure out what's the best way to move forward. And so I just raised that as we do this and we have this conversation, that there has to be a better forensic auditing system into new construction and into maintenance of our school systems, because the argument that we don't have the money, I don't believe that's true. I believe the integrity of managing our funds is a bigger problem than not having access to funds. And it's why people, some residents and others, don't want to entrust more money to elected officials because they don't trust how we're spending the money currently. And so I just think that no matter where we all stand on the conversation of P3s, because I see the chats, I think there's people that might agree with it and not. I think we all can agree that there needs to be some type of accountability and auditing done internally, which Prince George's County Public Schools. I've asked about it personally, and I don't know if Ms. Ahmed wants to speak to that too. I know she's asked about it personally, and we just do not currently have a proper auditing system in place.
So just to piggyback on that, Crystal, I think there was a Blue Ribbon Commission that was put together that was quoted when the proposed property tax increases were put forward. But that Blue Ribbon Commission said before any taxes were raised, the first thing to do is for Prince George's County to install an independent office of the Inspector General. So I know Montgomery County has an office of the Inspector General, and we always look there and say, look, they have this retail and that retail. Why can't we look there and say, we need an office of the Inspector General? Because, the less money you have, the more careful you have to be with your money. And I think that is really something to put forward and something for us, we have to internalize. And then, as you said, we have to make it happen. So we're getting close to our closing time. I'm going to ask Rahila where we stand on emails, and then give her the last word to wind up.
Sure. So we're at 38 emails right now. I would ask, at the beginning of this call, I made this ask of, hopefully by the end of this, you'll feel some type of way about this. And I do want to encourage everybody on this call convey your concerns to me and to the other elected officials of this county, whatever they may be, because it's important to make sure that we move forward in the right way with this project. As I said before, I'm very concerned. I've said I've been a skeptic at board meetings when it comes to this project. And so there's no question where I lie on this, but there is a question about where everyone else does. And so I want to encourage you all to continue with the advocacy, to share this Action Network link with your friends and neighbors, to make sure that their voices can also be heard in this. And also just thank you all for being here today. I mean, there were 101 different ways that we could have done this. A lot of ways that we could have gone in deeper on some of the concepts and talking points here. But I want to thank you all so much for sticking with us, talking with us, and just trying to learn, right? Like I have said to many people today, and many people previous who were very concerned about this event and holding it. A lot of folks that are the panelists here understand the amount of heat that has been coming because of this event. And you know, at the end of the day, I think it's all about making sure that we're all educated and in the entire picture of what this could look like. And for so long, we've kind of seen and heard, at least from my end, about the hopes behind this, but we haven't heard the realism. And I hope that you all also feel that you felt some realism today. And some of that other side, right? That devil's advocate, that kind of piece in your brain that you're wondering what's the opposite of this, and what is the argument that maybe is not being said. I hope you heard that today, because that's the only way that we can have a holistic picture and move forward with the best thing for our community. So with that, I want to also thank Suchitra, Jeremy, Shar, Crystal, Dave, Alvaro, John, Hal. I think Jaina and Martin had to drop off, but all the folks that have been involved and the coalition that helped to put this together. Folks, keep the activism going, and we'll see what happens. Let's just hope that it ends up being the best for our community and our kids.